The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I think sometimes winning is dying on the cross and saying, you know what, I will take up my cross and I will die for the benefit of other people. And that looks like a loss to the world, but for the Christian, that looks like a win.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Sho Baraka is a hip-hop artist, an activist, a co-founder of the AND campaign, and an author. His new book is He Saw That It Was Good, Reimagining Your Creative Life to Repair a Broken World. I agree with Esau McCauley, who said, Sho has not written a book for only creatives. He has written a book that will help all of us think intentionally about how the work we do, whatever it is, can be leveraged to fulfill God's purposes. He Saw That It Was Good is the wonderful mix of history, theology, art, and cultural analysis that we need in this moment. Well, Sho Baraka, I'm so glad you're able to join me on the Habit Podcast today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I am looking forward to this stimulating conversation.
So, Sho, I'm excited about your new book, He Saw That It Was Good, subtitled Reimagining Your Creative Life to Repair a Broken World. As I was just telling you a minute ago before we started recording, I thought I was just going to sort of skim your book to prepare for this conversation, and I found that I couldn't skim. There was just too much good stuff in there.
Yeah, that's probably high praise. That's the best kind of compliment you can get from somebody. So I am glad that it kept your attention.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, it's hard to even know where to start, but here's where I want to start. You talk about this idea. You say we hope to construct a new normal with truth and righteousness, and you're talking about doing that in creativity, in storytelling, and that's how literally do you mean that? Constructing a new normal through our creative endeavors.
I think I would like to think I mean that very literally, but I do think there's a figurative, there's an imaginative aspect to that. I think stories, as I've kind of communicated, I think stories help formulate identity and who we are. And so the more we tell healthy, honest stories about ourselves, I think it makes us better individuals and gives us more wholesome identities, more holistic identities to better engage with not only the people that I would like to label as people within our tribe, but people who are in the metropolis who are different from us, or where ideas come to, either flourish or die because they're challenged or they're pushed and they're squashed. Mm-hmm. And so the better we not only tell stories about ourselves, but how we tell stories about other people when we come to these center these city centers, and when we come to these the Areopagus, then we know how to better engage one another. And so when that happens, now we're there's an ability. There seems to be this great ability to be able to build a new understanding of how we should vote, how we should create policy, how we should love one another, interact, how we should deal with in conflict, and not weaponize, I guess you can say, the ideas and the stories, but rather use them to paint portraits so that we can be that they can be castigated, if you will.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you talk about a few different things with regard to how we shape reality through stories, and I think a really important point that you come back to a lot is, it's not. We use our imagination. We tell stories not just as a matter of saying, "Here's this invented future" or this invented reality. Although there's an element of that perhaps, but it's also telling stories to actually return to what's actually true, right? And so you talk about both memory, both looking forward, but also looking back, and in the memory of what is, what's true.
Yeah, I think if you don't have an honest memory, I say this, I think in a book, probably not word for word, but if you don't have a good memory, then you can't construct good futures. And I think a lot of people, there are people who want to preserve particular parts of history that I think are very poisonous and tainted. And there are people who want to pass through or overlook history and move towards a particular position that I don't know if it's quite helpful to not honor tradition. And so there's this wrestle, there's this dance. And I think all of humanity is trying to figure out how not to be messy in this dance. And so I think that's the beauty of memory. That's the beauty of imagination. And I think creativity is a way of trying to get people to disarm their most valued beliefs about themselves. And so, like, what about myself may be harmful to the world? What about myself? What about what I believe about maybe myself and the world might be harmful? And how do I reevaluate those things so that we can have better dialogue and conversation?
So a minute ago, you said we're trying not to be messy in the dance. I think I may be misquoting you, but I think that's what you said. Tell me about that. Are you saying that's a good impulse, or we need to just be willing? What are you?
Yeah. Maybe I should have said we are messy. Acknowledge our messiness, and then the goal is to become better as we dance. Like to be able to allow others to lead, to be able to learn how to lead, but recognizing that there is going to be some humanity is. I think it's the whole idea of good. I think it's foolish for us to think that we're always on the right side of history. I think it's foolish for us to think that we're consistently the heroes in the narrative. Yeah. And this is why I say, there are times when you are the villain. There are times when you may be the oppressor. There are times when you are marginalizing people. There are times when you're stepping on someone's feet when you're dancing. What makes it good is when you can acknowledge those frailties, when you can acknowledge those iniquities and say, you know what? I think that I am progressing towards the villain. I'm progressing towards villainy right now. I may need to reevaluate, do some self-inventory of what I believe and what I think, and try to figure out how might this not be beneficial for society. And this is why I look at individuals like Phyllis Wheatley, or I look at individuals like, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I'm like, they intended to write and do great things, but there were moments where they probably failed in that. And it may take time for them to get to a place of evaluating their work and saying, you know what, I would have done something, probably would have done it differently or done it better. And we all have to do that. We all have to consistently be evaluating our work and saying, at this moment, it may seem good, but 2 years from now, this work may be problematic, as a lot of people will say.
Yeah. You talk about us tending to tell stories in which we're the heroes. It's a strange habit we have of, when we read the Bible, assuming that, associating with the hero of the story, right? Assuming that I'm that I must, that I'm David in the story. It's possible I'm Goliath.
Yeah. And maybe not even Goliath. Maybe you're the Philistine. I mean, the Philistine, you're the Hebrew folks who are running and
That's right.
Afraid. You're like, I wish I had somebody to fight on my behalf. And I think that's where Jesus comes in and says, I'll be that advocate. And oftentimes we want to make ourselves that advocate. But there are times when we are the Philistines cheering on Goliath.
Yeah.
And I think it's just good for us to always evaluate like what we think is absolute truth, not absolute truth, I'm sorry, absolute rightness in the moments when we wield our particular truth, and how that can be very dangerous in moments where there is nuance.
Yeah. Yeah. And, since you mentioned absolute truth, this tendency to think that our cultural assumptions are somehow ultimate.
Absolutely. There's in chapter 4, I talk about, open the chapter talking about my grandfather who I say he's the kind of man who was made of denim and hard work. And so one thing I knew about my grandfather is that every time he ate dinner, no one could be in the kitchen. But if I look at evangelicalism as it is, the way that a family is demonstrates health is by sitting around the table and eating as a family, having these deep conversations about how was your day, highs, lows. Yeah. And I'm like, that may be great for that family, but every family can't operate like that. Because my grandfather woke up in the morning before the sun rose, and he stopped working. Now, I'm not saying that's a healthy life, but that's what he had to do in order to help his family, to provide for his family, and to create a living so that I didn't have to work that way if I didn't want to. And so the only piece of sanity that he had was, when it's time for me to eat, I want to eat in the solace of my own thoughts. And that is righteousness to me. Like, that's healthy for me. Like, that's, hey, amen. Let's give this man, let's honor him by giving him the opportunity to do this. And if we were to evaluate what healthy Christianity or healthy family dynamics are, we wouldn't say that's one of them. And I would say no, like the cultural, I guess the cultural proposition for someone else may not be something that's healthy and beneficial for another people.
Yeah. Well, this might be an opportunity for me to ask you to clarify something from your book that I found interesting, but I'm not sure I completely understood. And you talked about the relationship between gentrification and creativity.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mean? About, like, how can a person's creative life be gentrified?
Yeah, so I would say, and that's because it's the same chapter. I'll give a couple examples. One, I am not saying that gentrification in itself is entirely evil. What I am saying is there's an act within gentrification that changes not only the economic structure of a community, but it changes also like the cultural, like the dispersion of people is very dangerous. But there's a cultural element. There's the cultural erasure, if you will, that happens when people who have a particular idea flood a particular area, and their ideas become the norm of that particular space. In the creative aspect, I think what may happen is there's a way that art or there's a way that creativity is done, and then all of a sudden there's a predominant thought that brings their money, that brings their influence, and now it changes the way that people think and operate. And so now there's this cultural sensitivity that is lost. And so what I'm saying is in the Harlem Renaissance. And this is the reason why I use Zora Neale Hurston, and I love Zora Neale Hurston, and I love all the other individuals in the Harlem Renaissance. But when you look at the Harlem Renaissance, their main goal was to prop up what they thought was exceptionalism, Black excellence. And I think in order to fight against racial stereotypes and tropes, which I think is genius and is brilliant. However, there's a bit of shame that comes along with this high art, this academia, this exceptionalism, when you look at the low culture that Zora Neale Hurston was trying to show honor and respect to. And even this happens within tribes, is as we begin to change the educational, the economic status of a particular group or community of people, the folks who don't fit into those I guess fit nicely into those ideas begin to get marginalized, and they begin to they're forgotten about. And those people who don't fit into those ideas get pushed to the margins. They are forgotten, and that to me is the shame of how ideas, art, and work can be gentrified, if you will. I don't know if that brings clarity.
I wonder if it was the same chapter where you pointed out that the earliest Christian visual art was graffiti.
Yeah,
in the catacombs.
Yes, that is the same chapter. But
and then that somehow got pushed out of our, the idea. Now graffiti is low art. Right.
So you think about people who were lowly trying to just communicate like this is for whatever reasons this Christian art was used. It was used to bring about some community, some some synergy, I guess you will, some syncretism. However, now we look at that type of dealing of art as low culture. It's not worth real admonishment and praise in the halls of academia or seminaries. So here's where I'm saying there seems to be a little bit of a hypocrisy and struggle with this idea of gentrifying and gentry, the people of high status. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm trying to say. There's a status that controls what is good in a particular group of people. And Christianity has seen that. And we need to figure out how to do away with this idea of the gentrification of Christianity.
Yeah. Right. Again, I don't know if this is a new topic or we're continuing the same topic, but as I read through your book, I was really interested in a recurring theme that the idea of us embracing an identity that's smaller than the one that God gave us, and the ways in which the ways that embracing a smaller identity makes for worse creative work. And I'm just going to quote you here: brokenness in society reproduces itself when we create. Brokenness in society reproduces itself when we create from an identity smaller than the one God gave us, instead of reclaiming our rightful story. And I kept seeing that idea over and over, starting with, I think the first time you mentioned it is when in the Garden of Eden, the serpent says, hey, you don't have eternal, don't you want to be immortal? And well, they kind of already had that, and the ways in which these lies that tell us, hey, you're less than you're not enough, and you got to do more.
Yeah. I think that's the, what's the word I'm looking for? The irony, maybe. The irony of the duping in the garden is that it created this inversion that is really interesting, because we had the greatest identity possible, but we desired for something that actually removed us from having all that we desired in the tempting of whatever Satan communicated. And I don't even know if that made sense, but it made sense in my head. But at the end of the day, to your point, is that I think a lot of what I believe the gospel to be is not necessarily the redeeming of activity. Like, yes, we need to stop doing certain things. But what I find the gospel to be most beautiful, or when I find the gospel to be the most beautiful, is that it's redeeming my identity back towards who I am in God. Like, I am a creation of this magnificent being that created the galaxies, the earth. And so I am a product of that. And in that, I am to produce other products like that reflect his goodness. And I think oftentimes, not only in the spiritual sense, but even in our work sense, we create from small-mindedness, like, I walk into my job on a Monday through Friday basis, and I don't think that I have the ability to literally change culture, society, cities, or even this workplace. But you do. You have the ability, you have the capacity to literally bring life where you are as God brought life. And hopefully at the end of that, you can say it is good. And so that's what I'm trying to get people to stop thinking small-minded, and not only in just creating art, but also in living their everyday work, how they see themselves in their daily operating as human beings on this earth, and that we are not, God's just not concerned about your sex life, your drugs, or your lying, but he's concerned with who you are as a reflection of him.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the stories we tell are they are competing with other stories, other false stories that are being told.
Yes.
All the time. And you have a lot to say specifically with regard to race in America, right? The false stories that have been told about marginalized people, black folks, brown folks. And, again, it is, you've got it exactly right. When you talk about our, we change culture, we create or we participate in a new normal, a new and better normal through the stories we tell. But also the most, and you say this too, the most dangerous force against that are the false stories.
Yeah.
And
there's a it's a reason why I think I wanted to start the book off. The first chapter is dealing with stories, because I can talk about race, I can talk about justice, I can talk about I guess you can say sex and language, and I can talk about how to be excellent in your work. But the reality is that stories shaped all of those things. They're like when I was young, somebody made statements about work, and that impacted how I saw jobs for the rest of my life. When I was young, somebody told me stories about Koreans and Asians and white people, and that affected how I interacted with them for the rest of my life. When I was young, someone told me about foul language and sex, and so that impacted me for the rest of my life. And so what I wanted to say is, do you guys understand that we're always transmitting ideas, whether intentionally or unintentionally? And through that, people are being affected. We're creating like loose theology for people, or loose doctrines, or loose ideologies that may not be hardwired to paper or but there's stories that sit with people. Because I can remember so many stories as a young man that I recall that I'm like, man, that affected how I see this particular people or this particular group or this. And so we have to be very mindful about the stories, not only we tell through creative mediums, but also through our daily transmission of this information. When you're having conversations with relatives and there are young people or adults around, like you're communicating some sort of truth about the world, and you're painting God. And the way you paint God, people carry that portrait around and they hang that up and they say, well, this is how God looks to me. And apparently your God looks differently. And so therefore I'm offended. And so you need to be proselytized to this image of God. And my point is that we all paint terrible gods. And how do we begin to wield the paintbrush better?
So how do you wield the paintbrush better, Sho?
I think it comes with the first thing I like to think is humility, always moving with humility. And humility doesn't mean like not loving yourself. It doesn't mean not being proud of who you are, but it is also this aspect of loving who I am, but also recognizing that I'm a mess. Like I can go from righteous to ratchet in seconds. So that's one thing. I think it's also this aspect, and I give a couple, I give 7 principles at the end of the book, but I think it's also this aspect of, one of my favorite things is this that I talk about in the last chapter is bringing dignity to diversity, like dignifying people in diversity. It doesn't mean that uniformity, but and it doesn't even mean always like unity, but it also means like honoring people in their difference. It's like I don't really know. I don't know. I don't know any Australians, but I have assumptions. I have stereotypes of Australians. Vegemite, I assume, is the worst thing but I've never tasted it. I have these assumptions. But I also don't want to allow those assumptions to drive me to have such strong beliefs about them that when I meet them, I have these a checklist of discriminatory thoughts, and there's a wall and a barrier built. And I think that's what our society has done, and we allow that to continually be done through media, through social media, through our daily interactions. Is that and then we also have to understand, even within people groups, there's diversity within there. Like there's no homogeny within people group. White people, when you say white people, there's not this just unified understanding that all white people act like this. It's like, well, there are white people from the North, white people from the South. There are white people who have this. There are white people like, and so, it's the same thing with Black people. So there has to be dignity within the diversity. And I think one of the other things is, lastly, read the book, is hospitality. We have to be hospitable. So when we're humble, when we understand that people are different, how do we invite people to a space to where we can have kind of healthy conversations about how we are to operate? And I don't necessarily say or talk about this in the book, but then there's this, well, I do talk about it to some degree. There's this idea of what does it mean to win and lose? And I think our society today is fixated on winning.
Yeah.
And I think I may say this in the book, but I say it all the time. But sometimes winning is dying on the cross. And sometimes winning is losing in a Christian sense, is saying, you know what, I will take up my cross and I will die for the benefit of other people. And that looks like a loss to the world. But for the Christian, that looks like a win. And I think we have to get to a place where we recognize that everything won't fall in line for us.
Yeah.
And that is easy to say, maybe for me here, but the world is messy. I've been to no country. I traveled a lot, and every country I know has its problems. If it's not Ireland with religious tension, if it's not Rwanda with its tribal tension, if it's not India with its caste tension, it's America with its racial tension, it's going to be somewhere else, Greece or Italy with its political tension. Like the problem is that people want to find reasons to hate each other. And if it's not race, if it's not tribalism, it's not righteous, religious, if it's not caste and social, it's just the fact that your house is just too close to mine, and I just don't want your house that close to mine, and I'll figure out a way to get rid of you. And I think as humanity, we have to figure out how to take losses for the benefit of other people.
Yeah, I mean, this is related to something else you said, that when humans fall prey to a dishonest story, there are no winners, not even those enriched, and you put that in quotation marks, through manipulation or exploitation. Yeah. And when we think in terms of winning and losing, we start thinking things like, well, I can change, I can manipulate this story, or I can maybe manufacture, make my opponent seem a little worse than they really are.
Yeah.
So that I can win. But as you say, if we're not aligned with reality and what's true, then you haven't won.
Yeah, slavery is a perfect picture of how the marginalizing, the degradation, the moralization of a people is not just harmful for one group of people that's being subjugated, but it's harmful for the people who have a false sense of who they are, because they pass that down. It's a mental illness, and you begin to actually think way more highly than yourself, even in the benefits of of being somewhat of a oppressor and having power over people and getting financial compensation or benefits from this. At the end of the day, it has caused a mental illness in you, and there's nothing beneficial about suppressing people and benefiting from that. And thinking like, oh yeah, I'm enriched, but I'll be all right. Like, you have to deal with that. And I think Toni Morrison talks about this, and it's not, I don't mention this in the book, but it's a wonderful exchange she has with Charlie Rose on a PBS interview. And she says, racism is really a disease for white people to deal with. And Because you have this power and you do all this stuff and you subjugate, but does it make you a better person? Are you proud of yourself? And it's really something that you need to do it. Don't bring me into it, because I'm not the one who's doing the hating. I'm trying my best to exist in this world that has been created. And so you need to figure out how to deal with this mental disease that you have. And so that's what happens when you think that there are fruits of actions like caste system, tribalism, racism, but it affects both parties. It's poisonous. If
I move into a gated community, right, I'm just choosing to live inside a gate. You know, I mean, it's like I've built this prison and I put myself inside of it.
Exactly. And there's so much that the outside world can offer to you.
Yeah. Before we run out of time, and I've kind of lost track of time, I don't know if we run out of time or not, but I want to hear you comment on this insight. You said the heritage of Black creativity offers lessons for anyone, regardless of background, who wants to connect joyful resistance to the persevering imagination.
Yes,
a lot of people who listen to this podcast are white folks. Sho,
I love white.
And so talk to us about what the heritage of Black creativity means for a person not from a Black background.
Yeah, I think it's beneficial in many ways. I think when you think about pain is a great equalizer, because everybody's going to experience pain. There's no people anywhere on this earth who are, I guess you can say, who are exonerated from this great equalizer that, I don't know, God has allowed, which is pain. And so what I love to think is that there's a legacy of art that has been created from this posture of pain and perseverance that I think can be beneficial to anybody. And it doesn't have to be you're dealing with racial pain. It doesn't even have to be you're dealing with political pain. It can just be you're just dealing with relational pain. I think the truths that are communicated from people who were enslaved and making music or making art, talking about a joyful hope and a resistance, brings such a wonderful enlightenment and revelation to people who are trying to figure out their own mess. I think it's medicine for anybody's soul. And I think there's just this legacy of Black art and theology that has been tethered to this idea that God is not only good in the cognitive, but he's good in the corporeal, where he cares about my mental state, but he also cares about my physical being. And I know how to talk about this faith in a way that is not only intellectual assent, but it's experienced, because he liberated us. He walked with me when slave masters were whipping us. He's walked with me when families were being ripped apart. He walked with me when I wasn't allowed to eat at the same lunch counters. He's walked with me in the most dangerous of times, but yet and still I have a joy and a hope. And to me, there is nothing that I can face today in 2020 that is any more perilous than what my people before me have faced. And so I'm like, if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me.
That's great. I love the spiritual that you quote. I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children's got shoes, sung by people who probably didn't have shoes. Right, on their feet.
Yeah.
But we're talking about that God takes care.
Amen. It's simple. It's a simple thing. Think about that in 2020, like people need food. They need to feel protected. They need to feel safe. Like, is that not a gospel message? Is that not a good song, a gospel song? I need education. You need education. All God's people need education. Like, that's gospel. And I think today it wouldn't be considered gospel because it's like, no, woe is me. It has to be some sort of Hillsongish, not to make fun of Hillsong, but it has to be like this lofty, oh Lord, art thou whose presence blows the trees. Like, look, I just want to be able not to get pulled over by the police and make it to another day. That's gospel.
Amen. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. There's something else I want to talk about. There's lots of things I want to talk about, but here's something.
I feel the pushback.
This was a really a heartbreaking moment. There are plenty of heartbreaking moments in your book, but one was when you tell about your little girl who's grown up in a house where she is affirmed every day. Mm. And I think you indicated she goes to a school where she's affirmed every day, and your house is full of art done by Black folks, portraying Black folks as beautiful.
Yeah, as you can see, here's a little backdrop of a sit-in in our house. Kind of sit-in in the '60s. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
And your little girl comes to you and says, "I don't like my hair or the color of my skin." And you've in your household, you've done everything that can be done.
Right.
And your point is, hey, you do all you can do, but we got kids still their heads being filled with stories that you don't have any control over.
Right. Yeah.
Give me some hope out of that.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I don't really know if there's a ABCD strategy to say, here's what you do so that you never have to worry about that. Mm-hmm. I think youth are impressionable. I went through it as a young man. I wanted to be a white boy named Eric. I remember the Cavaricci jeans and just wanted to, that's what I wanted to be. Because I just felt like their life was easier. Yeah. I lived in a different, my childhood was different than my daughter's. So I would think she wouldn't have the same, issues that I had. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that there's still messages that you have to compete with. And as I talk about in the book, there's, Disney Channel, there's Nickelodeon, there are movies, there's this. And I don't expect Hollywood to care about identity affirmation if it doesn't make money for them. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, they want to make money. But as parents, I think what we have to understand is that the media in Hollywood is quite influential. And it's not just on when it comes to ideas of beauty and, racial affirmation. It's powerful when it comes to language, when it comes to ideas, when it comes to all types of things. My daughter's much older now. She's very affirmed in how she feels. And there are areas where she's still insecure. But in certain things, and some of those influences are because of social media, because of YouTube. Yeah. And you're always having to, once again, tango, to dance, to figure out, what does she need in this moment? What do the people around me need to hear? How do I love them? How do I affirm them? How do I tell them that they are good? How do I fight against these negative images, these negative stories, these stories that may be affirming for another family, but they may not be the most affirming for us. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing: I don't want other families and stories not to be affirmed, but I also don't want my family and my daughter to feel like this is the only idea of beauty. I think Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye is a wonderful novel about this very thing. It's not that blue eyes aren't beautiful and that people shouldn't celebrate the blueness of their eyes, but what about brown eyes? What about the different shades of brown, and how do you communicate no, you're good. God made you beautiful, and be contented in that.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks. All right. Last question. Who are the writers who make you want to write, or the artists who make you want to make art?
I mentioned her a couple times, so I'll just go ahead and just say her name. Toni Morrison is
the GOAT. Just amazing.
Yeah, she's the GOAT. And so the danger of people like Toni Morrison, G.K. Chesterton, Zora Neale Hurston, C.S. Lewis. These are folks that I love. I'm sure there are other folks that Gabriel Garcia Marquez. love 100 Years of Solitude and Cholera, Love in the Time of Cholera. These are the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you pick up their work and then you get inspired to write, you you look at your paper and you're like, this is a piece of bleep compared to what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I had to get over that tension first of being like comparing myself to these luminaries and these greats. But they're the people who inspire me. The stories they tell, how they tell it. It's just beautiful. It's just beautiful to sit there and listen. But music, I love all types of artists. Some of my favorites, Kanye West was,
Mm-hmm.
he's still, his music is not as good as it used to be, but I loved his music. John Mayer is a person that I love. I'm going to actually say a comedian, Dave Chappelle. He inspires me in ways that I think, even though I don't want to write comedy, but I think the way that he thinks and how he approaches a joke from an angle and people think he's coming from this angle, but then he kind of comes from a different position.
Yeah, he does.
He's a professor who just knows how to tell jokes, is what I think. I love 70s music. So, all of your just Motown. I like, I like to think that I'm a fan of Bob Dylan, but folks like Bob Dylan. But I'm really a casual fan when it comes to folks like I'm sure there are a bunch of people that I'm just not thinking of.
Yeah, sure. Well, I kind of put you on the spot. So
yeah.
Well, Sho Baraka, man, we talked about maybe 1/8 of the things I wanted to talk about, but there just wasn't enough time in the day. So thank you so much for
thank you for reading the book. And I've done a lot of interviews where, many people have read the book and there's some who haven't. And I just appreciate you asking really, really poignant questions about the book. It was good.
Well, I hope a lot of people read it. It did me a lot of good. So.
Hey, man. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.